during the 12-day war, you probably remember a lot of people were saying that, okay, well, Iran didn't ask Russia and China for enough military assistance, so they weren't prepared enough to withstand maybe the worst excesses of that surprise attack that Israel and the U.S. launched. Now we're in the financial side, the economic side, where it said that, and you outlined it well, that Iran and China could do currency swap deals. They could make it a lot easier for the currency manipulation to be countered. So I guess I'm wondering then, what's the full picture here? Because some were saying that for the Starlink issue, how Iran was able to penetrate Starlink and essentially shut it down. That was done with either Russian or Chinese technology. And the reality is that, in this iteration of this proxy war, this war that the U.S. is trying to wage, they were able to counter the color revolution, the regime change operation, but it happened and it killed hundreds of people. So, it was sparked initially by, as you said, protests against the financial manipulation that had real effects on standard of living. So what's the full picture here about the Russia-China connection, how they're helping and not helping Iran?
Well, they are not giving the game away, right? Danny, the Russians and the Chinese are being extremely circumspect, which is predictable, because most of these issues fall into the realm of national security on those three sides. In fact, it's part of their their interlocking strategic partnerships and matters of national security, and especially in the case of Russia and Iran, how deep is their military collaboration? We know it's very, very deep, and we know from what we heard in Moscow from Iranian envoys doing the back and forth Tehran-Moscow to discuss military integration, in fact. In terms of all those IL-76, landing in Tehran practically full time, they were bringing stuff that is quite substantial. We don't know exactly what. Could be anything. Missile defense systems, cybersecurity equipment, you name it. And of course, what we know and confirmed even diplomatically by ministries of defense on the three sides, you can even include China, is that it's absolutely clear that Russia and China cannot allow Iran to fall in terms of not necessarily the fall of this current government setup, but to fall in terms of being annexed as a vassal and as a colony to the empire of chaos, plunder, and permanent strikes. So this is quite clear in Moscow and in Beijing. But of course, the sensitive information, none of us have access to that. Of course, we know it's deep. For instance, something that we discovered, I would say a few days after that, at the beginning of the 12-day war, it was Russian know-how that managed the Iranians to reconstitute their grid in less than 48 hours. But you won't get the Russian Ministry of Defense saying that on the public record. Forget it. Not to mention the Iranians. And of course, for instance, when we visit Iran and we visit the IRGC, for instance, they showed us, the last time, for instance, they showed us only what's publicly available, and everybody in Iran knows about it. They didn't show us their next generation missiles or hardware or software, which at the time they already had. And some of it they used in the last few days of the 12-day war, and some of it is completely new and they're going to use in the next operation. So, of course, there's this element of secrecy, and at the same time, there's this element of their the deeper military scientific collaboration between Iran and Russia, especially, is very, very deep. And you add to it the scientific quality that you see in the best Iranian universities, which is something that will be the envy of practically everywhere in Europe and in most parts of the United States. So it is immensely impressive. But conceptually, it's very clear for the Iranians, for the Russians, and for the Chinese. This is our Eurasia integration fight. And we all know that the empire only has one shot, because the only way for them to destabilize a meaningful crossroads across Eurasia would be Iran. Turkey is different. Turkey is the wall of Istanbul, as we have been discussing it. It's the limit between NATO-Stan and Eurasia. But Turkey is still over the wall, sitting on the fence, still infinitely, right? The Central Asian stans are minor players. India and Pakistan is a different story because they're more concentrated in South Asia. Southeast Asia is different. It's an enormous trade, commercial power, but not a big geopolitical player. So that's it. We are left with this ancestral crossroads of Eurasia since the times immemorial of the earliest Persian empires. And of course, in terms of people in the US who still think, conditioned by the Mackinder, Spikeman, Brzezinski interpretation of Eurasia, it's something they can never swallow. We cannot allow Iran to be sovereign and independent. We have to go there and break it up. And at the same time, now they know if you go there and break it up, Russia and China are going to react. We still don't know how. So, this is the new great game in action for over the past 4 decades, in fact, since the start of the Islamic Revolution, which at the time, it's fascinating, nobody knew that the Islamic Revolution would go the way it did. A lot of people were expecting the Communist Party to be have a place of prominence, and in the end, that was not exactly the idea of the clerical establishment, because in the history of Iran, and this is something we have to keep it very, there's always this alternance between clerical power and monarchic power. And we are in one of those historical periods in Iranian history. No?
Yeah.
Of course, we will never have the return of the monarchy, especially when you have a clown posing as the monarch, right? They try to sell this clown to Western public opinion, and not many people bought it. Even here in Europe, very few people bought it, because you can see right away that he does not even qualify as a clown. Ensconced in Maryland, trying to give lessons to Iran from his. It's pathetic. So they don't have a replacement plan. The only plan they have is to blow it all up. So this is a famous which passed to Persia with everybody. It's a pretty pathetic document, by the way, and people keep talking about it. Blah blah blah. No, it just outlines blow up scenarios. That's it.
Yeah.
In a sense that, okay, let's create the new Iraq. Let's create the new Libya. Let's destroy like we destroyed Iraq, like we destroyed Libya, and like we destroyed Syria long term.
One of the biggest concerns that many have on the outside of Iran is, some have said, "Oh, is Iran asleep at the wheel when it comes to these kind of surprise attacks? Are they preparing?" You wrote in your article, and I want to pull it back up. You had a whole section about how Iran counters a regime change war. Maybe you can get into more of the details here, because I think sometimes people focus a lot on one element, for example, intelligence, or air
Yes.
defenses and things like this. But it really is how to counter regime change. You outline it really well here. There's so many components to it.
One of them, Danny, which would require probably an article in itself, is that the government called the bazaris to have meetings, to listen to them about cost of living, what their customers are buying or not buying or complaining about, etc. Right at the beginning of the protests. You know how this was interpreted in U.S. mainstream media? I read this in some of the think tank reports. The bazaris have abandoned the government, so now it's over for Khamenei and the mullahs. It was exactly the opposite. The government called the bazaris to talk to them to see, look, is there any, we don't have a lot of cash, but how can we help your business, and what are your customers telling you about cost of living, etc. So they were, the bazaar and the government were talking from the beginning. When we had the Islamic Revolution 78, 79, it was a completely different story, because the bazaris were against the Shah. The bazaris rebelled against the Shah. It's a completely different. So only stupid people who don't know nothing about the history of Iran this past 40, 45, 50 years could come up with that, So they were worried. And the argument of Tehran, okay, that includes economic management on several levels. All right, that exists. But you cannot underestimate the absolutely toxic effect of over 40 years of sanctions on everyday life all across Iran. This is something that you only understand as a foreigner if you go to Iran and if you travel in Iran. In my case, I've been there more than 10 times. And every time that I come back, I'm always shocked by the degradation, especially of infrastructure. And it's directly linked to the effects of these absolutely horrible sanctions, in ports, in airports, the urban configuration, the urban landscapes, apart from parts of Iran that are being built from scratch. For instance, when you get to the Chabahar port in near the Pakistani border, they are building Chabahar practically from scratch. That's a different story, because they know it's going to be a great hub for the future. But if you go to certain neighborhoods in Tehran itself, not the north, which is upper middle class, it's the Tehrangeles crowd, If you go to southern Tehran, and the outskirts of southern Tehran, which is basically working class, most of it very, very poor, the infrastructure is decaying. It's infrastructure at best from the mid-70s, and that's it. And then the whole thing stopped. So, the fact that the government is still able to function and provide at least a basic service with all these problems is in itself extraordinary. And don't forget that the basic necessities of an Iranian family, like gas and electricity, is subsidized by the government. It costs practically nothing. But of course, the government has to pay for all that in the end. So, and obviously there are enormous limits, and there are no... there's not a lot of substantial external help, which is something that I alluded in my column. It is a very controversial question, and only the Chinese, only Beijing, I would say, localized top officials in Beijing could answer this question. Why didn't they help Iran when it was obvious that there was a speculative attack on the real? This is something the Chinese could have done, taking a little bit of their gigantic foreign reserves, and it would cost them peanuts, and they didn't. This is something that we should ask the powers that be in Beijing. For instance, why the NDB couldn't make a few loans to Iran? considering that the NDB is the BRICS bank and Iran is a BRICS member. We get to where? The power of the US dollar. The statutes of the NDB, the BRICS bank, are in US dollars. If they make a loan to Iran and it goes through the international financial system and is linked to the dollar, the NDB itself will be subjected to American sanctions, which proves once again to all of us, and this is something that my dear friend Paulo Nogueira Batista, one of the co-founders of the NDB, says, we have to start from scratch. You cannot have a development bank for the global south using the currency of the empire. It's completely out of the question. So, the constraints on Iran are tremendous. So, and their staying power is, wow, it's very, very impressive. And it links to something much more subtle, beyond ideology, which is metaphysical, in fact, which is the Shiite concept of resistance, the Shiite concept of martyrdom, that if you become a martyr, it's for a higher cause, but especially the Shiite concept of resistance under maximum pressure of the empire, in this case, which was right at the beginning of the Islamic Revolution. The conceptualization of the Islamic Revolution was to link anti-colonialism with this Shiite concept of resistance. So now we have we can say a variation of those ideals, the pure ideas in the beginning of the Islamic Revolution. Okay, many of them were corrupted. This is something we can argue to eternity. But this initial flame, let's say, anti-colonialism and spirit of resistance, is what we're seeing now in Iran after this failed regime change operation. You see a renewed sense of, yes, we have to fight against this new colonial imperial power, and we have to get deeper into our Shiite conceptualization of the spirit of resistance. So in the end, the empire, once again, it's a favor that they made to Iran nowadays.
Yeah,
history works in mysterious ways. Usually with a measure of poetic justice. So the poetic justice that we see now is that, okay, so now we're going to resist even more, right. Which, bringing back to that famous articulation by the strategic advisor.
Yep. Yeah. And maybe just lastly, because I do want to talk about the other aspects of the Eurasia push by the United States empire, especially Neo-Caligula and his empire of plunder. But yeah, you have, of course, Netanyahu. You mentioned that think tank report, The Path to Persia. What's so interesting now after this operation, Pepe, is when you hear Netanyahu say things like this, like he did in the so-called parliament in Israel today. He said that if Iran attacks Israel, we will act with strength that Iran hasn't yet known. And then he says, Iran will never return to what it once was. But the language is not offensive. It's if Iran attacks us. There has been a bit of a shift of, I think, how this is looking. Yeah, right. It's very
because his generals are not stupid. They know what can happen. Netanyahu is not a military expert, on the contrary. But his generals, they saw what a few hypersonic Iranian missiles did. And this was just a few, not 1,000.
No. And there have been reports flying around all over social media about Iran having 2,000, even 20,000 missiles
I saw
moving about. We don't know how much, of course, but
no, 2,000
thousands.
2,000 it's already too much. Russia doesn't have 2,000 hypersonic missiles. So right. If Iran has 100, it's already wow. Because as far as I think they launched at the end of the 12-day war, they launched less than 10. And that was already
And we all
massive.
saw the images.
Exactly.
We all saw the images of
Exactly.
what happened there, and those went viral. And yeah, it's going to be interesting because in the United States, even Pepe, the approval rating from the public polled in the U.S. is so low on Iran's
Low.
strike.
Yeah.
There is no. The pretext was so interesting. Trump said it was protecting the protest, saving the protesters, and that was the exact opposite. In what's interesting about that, that's the exact opposite kind of language that he was invoking, even leading into the early days of his administration. So it was a complete reversal, and he sounded just like someone on the Beltway in this round, and it's likely he's going to have to sound like that again in order to invoke the kind of pretext needed to strike. Because as you said, the USS Lincoln, and there's fighter jets and all kinds of things moving that direction.
Exactly. And he can go probably the most plausible scenario. He go for pro forma strike, and then he changes the subject.
Yeah. Yep.
There you go.
Venezuela.
As we all know, the only subject all over the planet now is Greenland.